At 87, Mary Wilson finally broke her silence. For decades, she stood in the shadows of Diana Ross, smiling as Motown presented perfection to the world. But behind that polished curtain, Mary carried secrets. And now, in her final years, she lets one of them slip, shocking everyone. It happened almost casually, as if Mary Wilson had grown tired of carrying the weight. After decades of carefully curated interviews, where she mastered the art of saying enough, but never too much, Mary finally let something slip. And this time, it wasn't just another nostalgic memory about the Supremes' glory days. It was a raw, unguarded truth. In one of her later interviews, Mary admitted that Motown was like a family, but they all think of themselves as distant cousins. Those words might sound simple, almost harmless, but to anyone who has followed the history of Berry Gordy's empire, they carried a sting. Mary had always been the peacekeeper, the voice that softened the sharp edges between Diana Ross, Florence Ballard, and Motown itself. Yet at 87, her filter was gone. This was a woman who had spent her youth smiling through the favoritism, the rebranding of her group without her consent, and the slow erasure of her own presence. For years, she said little, protecting the illusion that Motown was a dream factory. But in her slip, she confirmed what so many suspected. Behind the glitter, it was a battlefield. The sting wasn't just in what Mary revealed, but in how she revealed it, with the exhaustion of someone who no longer cared about the consequences. Diane was one to covet anything that belonged to anyone else. That kind of honesty cut through decades of silence. Diana stole the spotlight from the other girls, and Motown perpetuated it. And here's the thing, this wasn't the first time a Motown star pulled back the curtain. Marvin Gaye had done it. Stevie Wonder had done it. Even Diana Ross, in her careful way, let fragments escape. But Mary's confession was different, because she wasn't the star. She was the one who saw everything, endured everything, and lived to tell it. Mary Wilson was always there. On stage, in photographs and television appearances, she was the constant presence, the reliable harmony behind Diana Ross's lead and Florence Ballard's raw power. She didn't crave the spotlight the way Diana did, and she didn't break under the pressure like Florence. Instead, Mary became something else. The backbone, the quiet stabilizer of the group that helped Motown project an image of perfection. But from the moment Berry Gordy decided Diana Ross would be the center, Mary realized her career would forever be defined by someone else's shine. She wasn't the leading lady, she was the accessory to the leading lady. Still, Mary was no fool. She learned how to endure, how to swallow hurt in exchange for survival. In every television interview, she was gracious, echoing lines about sisterhood and family. To fans, the Supremes looked unbreakable. But in her memoir, Dream Girl, My Life as a Supreme, the mask slipped. Critics even called it Diana Dearest because Mary dared to tell the truth about favoritism and betrayal. She wrote of nights when she felt invisible, of decisions made without her input, of the heartbreak of seeing the group's identity warped around Diana alone. Yet even with her pain, she never stopped showing up. While Florence fought back and paid the price, Mary held her tongue. She was the glue that held the Supremes together, and please believe me, that's a rough role to play. Todd Williams said about Mary during an interview, "She rehearsed, she toured, she endured. Without her, the Supremes might have collapsed under the weight of resentment long before their fame peaked." The cruel irony was that her strength was often mistaken for weakness. To the public, Diana was the star, Florence the tragic figure, and Mary the extra. That steady smile, polished, unshaken, unwavering, hid the truth that she carried wounds no one wanted to see. But silence is a fragile shield, and as the years passed, Mary Wilson began to let the truth seep through the cracks. To understand Mary Wilson's silence, you have to understand Motown itself. Berry Gordy didn't just run a record label, he built a factory. Every artist, every song, every performance was manufactured with precision. The goal wasn't just to create hits, it was to create stars who could cross over, who could be accepted in living rooms across America. That meant perfection, and perfection always came at a price. Motown had its own version of finishing school. Under the guidance of Maxine Powell, young singers were taught posture, diction, grooming, and etiquette. They practiced how to walk into a room, how to sit, how to smile, and even how to hold a fork at dinner. Choreographer Charlie Atkins drilled them on stage presence, while in-house producers polished every note until it gleamed. For Mary Wilson and the Supremes, this meant endless hours rehearsing in front of mirrors, practicing the same gestures until they became second nature. Every hair had to be in place. Every word had to sound graceful. By the time they walked out on stage, they were not just singers. They were polished symbols of Motown's ambition. But behind that elegance was something else. Control. Motown's system wasn't designed to give artists freedom, it was designed to keep them in line. Songs were assigned, not chosen. Costumes were approved, not selected. Every appearance was scheduled to the minute. Even interviews were scripted, so no artist could embarrass the label with an unguarded word. Years later, Mary reflected on this, saying that the Supremes lived more like employees in uniforms than like independent artists. Diana Ross thrived in the system because her ambition perfectly aligned with Gordy's demands. But Mary saw what it did to others. Florence Ballard, with her fiery personality, pushed back and was punished. Marvin Gaye nearly lost his career for wanting to make socially conscious music. Even Smokey Robinson, Gordy's closest friend, admitted later that the machine could be suffocating. Mary Wilson's resilience didn't come from Motown. It was born long before she ever set foot in Hitsville. Born on March 6, 1944 in Greenville, Mississippi, Mary spent her earliest years in poverty before her family migrated north to Detroit. Like so many black families of the era, they moved in search of better opportunities, but the hardship followed them. Detroit's Brewster Douglas housing projects, where Mary was raised, became her training ground in survival. Life there wasn't glamorous, but it was formative. In interviews, Mary often reflected on how the close-knit but struggling community shaped her. Families shared what little they had, children turned sidewalks into playgrounds, and the church was the center of everything. For Mary, the constant instability meant she grew up learning to adapt quickly. If something was taken away, you found another way to stand. That instinct to keep showing up no matter what would later define her role in the Supremes. Her childhood also forced her into responsibility early. As one of 3 children, she learned to shoulder burdens quietly, never making herself the source of more trouble for her parents. That silence, that ability to keep her feelings tucked neatly behind a smile, was a survival skill that followed her into adulthood. In Motown, it looked like discipline, but in truth, it was self-protection. It was also in Detroit that she first met Florence Ballard and Diana Ross, the 2 girls who would eventually change her life. Their friendship began long before fame, back when they were just neighborhood kids with oversized dreams. They all shared the same hunger for something bigger, but for Mary, it was more than a dream. It was a chance to escape the cycles of poverty and struggle she had seen her entire childhood. By her teens, Mary was already chasing that escape. She sang in school, joined local groups, and soaked in the music that surrounded Detroit. Survival was no longer just about food or housing. It was about finding a voice. And Mary, even if she didn't yet know it, was preparing to carry that voice into the storm that was Motown. Before they were global icons, they were just 3 neighborhood girls with a dream. Mary Wilson, Diana Ross, and Florence Ballard grew up within blocks of each other in Detroit's Brewster Douglas projects. Their paths crossed naturally, through school, through church, and through the kind of youthful ambition that turned ordinary friendships into extraordinary partnerships. In 1959, the 3 girls, along with Betty McGlown, formed a group called the Primettes. They weren't polished stars yet. They were teenagers singing at school events, church socials, and block parties. Mary later recalled how they would hang around Motown's Hitsville, USA studio for hours, hoping someone would notice them. "We used to stand outside like little kids at the candy store," she once said. "We just wanted to be let in." Their persistence paid off. In 1960, with the encouragement of Smokey Robinson, the Primettes auditioned for Berry Gordy. At first, he turned them down, telling them to come back when they were older. Most kids would have quit, but Mary, Florence, and Diana kept showing up day after day, rehearsing, recording demos, and begging for another chance. That kind of determination was rare, and Gordy eventually noticed. By 1961, the Primettes officially signed with Motown and were renamed the Supremes. The name itself suggested ambition. It wasn't about being good, it was about being the best. But their early years were anything but supreme. Between 1961 and 1963, the group recorded multiple singles, and every one of them flopped. Motown staff quietly called them the No-Hit Supremes. For young women trying to prove themselves, it was humiliating. Still, Mary's survival instincts kept her grounded. While Florence grew frustrated and Diana pushed harder for the spotlight, Mary remained steady. She believed that if they just endured the failures long enough, their moment would come. And she was right. In 1964, their single "Where Did Our Love Go" hit number 1 on the Billboard charts. Almost overnight, the Supremes went from local hopefuls to international stars. The success should have been sweet, but for Mary, the triumph was complicated. She was living her dream, yet she could already see the cracks forming, the favoritism, the quiet betrayals, the politics that would define the Supremes' rise. For now, though, she smiled, because after years of waiting outside Hitsville's doors, Mary Wilson had finally stepped inside. Success didn't just change the Supremes' fortunes, it changed their dynamics forever. As soon as the group started climbing the charts, Berry Gordy began making choices that would leave scars. And the deepest cut came when he made it clear that Diana Ross, not Florence Ballard, not Mary Wilson, was the chosen one. Mary had seen the favoritism building in small ways. More solos given to Diana, more attention during rehearsals, more flattering costumes tailored for her. But the betrayal became undeniable in 1967 when Motown officially rebranded the group as Diana Ross and the Supremes. For Mary, who had been there from the beginning, it felt like a quiet erasure. It wasn't just about names on a poster, it was about identity, history, and recognition. It was like the rest of us didn't exist anymore, she later wrote in her memoir, Dreamgirl. The cruelest betrayal, however, wasn't the renaming. It was what happened to Florence Ballard. Florence had been the founding spark of the group, the one with the most powerful voice. But Florence's clashes with Gordy, her struggles with alcohol, and her refusal to play by Motown's rules made her vulnerable. One night, after a disastrous performance in Las Vegas, Florence was abruptly replaced by Cindy Birdsong. No discussion, no warning, just gone. Mary was devastated. Florence wasn't just a colleague, she was her childhood friend, her sister in ambition. Seeing her discarded so easily made Mary realize how disposable they all were under Gordy's control. Yet Mary chose silence. She stayed in the group, smiled for the cameras, and tried to hold the fractured pieces together. But inside, she carried the betrayal. Years later, in interviews, she admitted how painful it was to watch Florence spiral into poverty and obscurity, while Diana was pushed higher and higher into the spotlight. Florence would die at just 32, her dreams stolen by the very system that once celebrated her. And through it all, Mary Wilson endured. She became the witness, watching her best friend destroyed and her group rebranded in someone else's name. The Supremes were breaking records, but Mary knew the cost. It was betrayal dressed up as success, and she could never forget it. The Supremes looked like the picture of success: elegant gowns, flawless smiles, and #1 hits. But behind the glamour, the reality was brutal. Mary Wilson would later reveal just how little the artists actually earned compared to the wealth Motown was raking in. At the height of their fame in the 1960s, the Supremes' royalties on record sales were a measly 2.7%, and even that sliver of profit rarely made it directly to their pockets. Motown often withheld the money, claiming it was being set aside for taxes or contingencies. Instead, the singers received small weekly stipends, often no more than $10 or $20. Imagine topping the Billboard charts, traveling the world, and being hailed as America's top girl group while quietly struggling to cover basic expenses. Mary endured it quietly, but she never forgot it. In her 2009 interview with Elsewhere, she admitted how unfair it felt. "We were young. We didn't know the business. We trusted. And by the time you learned, the contracts had already tied you up." For Mary, silence was survival, but it was also suffocation. She watched colleagues like Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder fight back, demanding control over their music, while she tried to keep the peace. Control extended beyond money. Berry Gordy and his executives decided everything: which songs were released, how they were performed, and even which versions of recordings made it to the public. If a song was recorded by two groups, the losing version was shelved, but the artists were still billed for studio costs. Mary later pointed to this practice as one of the ways Motown kept artists indebted, even when they were selling millions of records. But Mary didn't storm out. She didn't sue. She didn't confront Gordy the way others did. Instead, she did what she had always done. She endured. She carried the weight of injustice quietly, smiling on stage while the business of Motown drained her behind the scenes. Yet her silence was not consent. It was a shield, because Mary understood something many didn't. Those who spoke out too loudly often disappeared, and she was determined, no matter how unfair the system, to survive long enough to tell the story herself. Motown thrived on image. To the public, it was polished, glamorous, untouchable. But Mary Wilson lived through the scandals that were carefully hidden behind the curtain, and decades later, she began to acknowledge just how much was buried. One of the most infamous stories was Florence Ballard's sudden dismissal after that disastrous night in Las Vegas in 1967, where Florence appeared disheveled and possibly intoxicated. Motown executives acted without hesitation. Florence was sent home, and by the next performance, Cindy Birdsong was standing in her place. No announcement, no explanation. To the fans, the change was seamless. But to Mary, it was devastating, a reminder that in Gordy's empire, even founding members could be erased overnight. The truth is, they were replaceable. But Florence's fate wasn't the only secret. Mary remembered how recording sessions often produced multiple versions of a song, with each version performed by different groups. Gordy would then decide which one to release at the infamous quality control meetings. The rejected versions, they were scrapped, but the artists were still charged for the studio time and musicians. Mary quietly witnessed how these hidden debts piled up, trapping performers in contracts they could never escape. There were darker rumors too, stories of relationships blurred between business and personal lives, whispers of favoritism that went far beyond professional decisions. Mary never spilled every detail, but she admitted in interviews that power at Motown was concentrated in the hands of a few men, and stepping out of line often meant the end of a career. That fear kept many silent. She also knew the cost of challenging the system. Marvin Gaye had risked everything to release What's Going On. Stevie Wonder had fought tooth and nail for artistic independence. But for women, the stakes were even higher. Mary, Florence, and Diana didn't just have to sing. They had to smile, obey, and play roles that Motown scripted for them. Any hint of rebellion could be labeled as difficult and used to push them out. Mary carried these secrets like scars. For years, she kept them hidden under loyalty and professionalism. But by the time she reached her 80s, she no longer felt bound to protect the image Motown had worked so hard to preserve. And once she began to speak, the world finally saw the cracks in the empire's glossy facade. For millions of fans, being a Supreme looked like a dream. Beautiful gowns, world tours, hit songs. It seemed like the pinnacle of success. But for Mary Wilson, the cost of carrying that crown was heavier than anyone could imagine. On the surface, she smiled. She stood in perfect harmony behind Diana Ross, moved in sync with Florence Ballard or Cindy Birdsong, and lived up to the image Berry Gordy demanded. But inside, she was carrying constant tension. Every performance was another reminder that she wasn't the star, even though she had been there from the very beginning. Every photo shoot, every headline that singled out Diana was another quiet wound. Mary admitted years later that the emotional toll was worse than the financial one. In her memoir, she confessed that she often felt invisible, treated as if her presence was optional. Critics praised Diana as the face of Motown, while Mary became known as the one always smiling in the background. That label hurt her. She wanted to be seen too. The jealousy within the group also weighed on her. Florence's bitterness toward Diana often spilled over, and Mary found herself caught in the middle, forced to mediate arguments while quietly grieving the loss of her own voice. Even when Florence was removed, the atmosphere didn't improve. Now it was Diana at the center and Mary as the silent witness, expected to keep the machine moving. The physical toll was just as brutal. Long tours meant sleepless nights, constant rehearsals, and relentless pressure to be perfect. Motown stars were always on, always performing, always rehearsing, always selling the brand. Mary often recalled collapsing into bed after 18-hour days, only to wake up and do it all over again. Yet she endured. For Mary, quitting wasn't an option. She stayed because the Supremes were more than just a group. They were her family, her creation, her identity. But the cost was immense. By the time the group began to fracture in the late 1960s, Mary wasn't just tired. She was bruised emotionally, financially, and spiritually. And she carried those bruises long after the spotlight dimmed. For years, Mary Wilson played the loyal soldier. She toured, recorded, smiled, and rarely let her pain slip into the public eye. But by the mid-1980s, she had reached a point where silence was no longer enough. In 1986, she released her memoir, Dream Girl: My Life as a Supreme, a book that critics quickly nicknamed Diana Dearest because of how candid it was about the favoritism inside Motown. In the memoir, Mary revealed what fans had only suspected. She wrote about the endless rehearsals, the unfair contracts, the slights and betrayals that defined her years in the group. She admitted how painful it was to see Diana elevated while she and Florence were sidelined. There is a certain thing about Diana, she wrote. She wants everything herself. It wasn't spiteful, it was honest. For the first time, Mary stopped protecting the image of Motown and started protecting her own truth. The book was a bestseller, not just because it told Motown's story, but because it told Mary's story. Readers were shocked to discover that behind the glossy facade of the Supremes was a woman who had been carrying wounds for decades, and Mary wasn't afraid to name names. She spoke about Gordy's obsession with control, about the cruelty of Florence's removal, and about the silence she had been forced to maintain. Her later interviews only deepened that honesty. In a 2009 conversation with Elsewhere, Mary reflected on the financial exploitation. "We were so excited, we didn't read the small print. We just thought we were going to be recording. Subsequently, we ended up signing away our rights to our band name. It was a sobering reminder of how little power the artists had, even when they were topping the charts." Mary also became an advocate for artists' rights, pushing for fairer treatment and royalties for Motown performers who had been left behind. Her voice, once confined to background harmonies, grew louder in her later years. And unlike many who burned bridges, Mary balanced truth with grace. She still called Diana her sister, still spoke of Motown's brilliance, but she never hid its darkness again. By the time she reached her 80s, Mary Wilson was no longer just the smiling background singer. She was the keeper of the story, the one who had lived it all, endured it all, and finally found the courage to speak without restraint. When Mary Wilson reached her late 80s, she no longer felt the need to guard Motown's secrets. The carefully polished interviews, the cautious smiles, those belonged to a younger woman who still believed silence was survival. At 87, survival no longer meant silence. It meant honesty. In one of her final candid conversations, Mary reflected on the years she had spent in the shadows of Diana Ross and Berry Gordy's empire. "They made one star," she admitted, "and it wasn't me. But I was there. I lived it all." That confession landed like a thunderclap. For decades, she had been the background harmony, the quiet witness. Now she was reclaiming her place in the narrative. She spoke about Florence Ballard with tenderness, still haunted by how her friend had been cast aside and forgotten. She recalled the endless tours, the sleepless nights, and the pennies she earned while the label grew rich. What made these late-life admissions so powerful was not just the content, but the delivery. Mary didn't speak with anger. She spoke with the weary honesty of someone who had carried the truth too long. There was no need for revenge, only revelation. Her words were measured, but they stripped away the illusion that Motown was only about dreams. 4 years after her death, fans are still stunned at the revelations. After all, if Mary Wilson, the peacekeeper, the eternal smile, had finally peeled back the curtain,